Greetings and welcome back to 303 in Junior English. We now turn in your hymnals to pages 1108, 1109 and following, and we now turn to the second of our political titles and political texts. And your textbook is going to put them together. Probably, I think it'll be obvious for you for good reason. This is Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham City Jail. Now, you're not going to have the full letter written. You're only going to have a cutting from the letter, and there's really some important information that we want to pay attention to. But let's just pause here for a moment and reiterate what we said in our last conversation with the inaugural address of John F. Kennedy. In American political and literary thought, we have kind of two strands. We have as of course you'll know because you've been sitting in 303 and in this class, we have those traditionally literary texts, like for example Longfellow's Psalm of Life, or Baldwin's Rock Pile. These are just titles that we study, poems and stories and occasional essays. But then we have a second collection of texts that we've studied over the time together. And these are political texts which become literary texts. The Declaration of Independence, yes, it is an essay, but it is a political essay, right? The Gettysburg Address by Lincoln, that is a speech by Lincoln given, of course, at the Battle of Gettysburg years or months after the terrible three-day battle there. But that's a famous speech. Of course, we just got through looking at the inaugural speech of John F. Kennedy. We now are going to turn to a famous letter. But this is a political document that we will be studying. But again, we're going to stay away from a lot of the politics involved in the document and go right to the heart of the rhetorical elements. What makes this a powerful letter? How does this work was the question we asked about the Kennedy speech. Let's start though with some biographic information on 1108. Read along with me. Of course, you have your dates, 1929 to 1968, and of course 1968 is the tragic year when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, killed. Martin Luther King Jr., just read with me. Martin Luther King Jr. was born into a family of ministers. Both his father and maternal grandfather were Baptist preachers. At Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, King originally planned to study both medicine and law. However, under the influence of his mentor, the college president and eloquent orator Benjamin Mays, King committed himself to the ministry and to the struggle for racial equality. Formative years, the next heading. King prepared for the ministry at Koser Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania. There, the nonviolent philosophy of the Indian leader Mahatma Gandhi made a critical impression on him. At Boston University a few years later, King earned a doctorate in theology, which is why we call him Dr. Martin Luther King. So let's just pause for a moment. I pointed this out to some juniors who say, wow, I guess I never really knew that. I knew he was called Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but I didn't actually know doctor. I thought he was like a doctor where, you got a cold and so he prescribes medicine. No. That's not the kind of doctor he was. He's a doctor of theology, the study of God and religion. So Martin Luther King Jr. started out wanting to be a medicine doctor and ended up being a theological doctor, and of course we could say a political doctor to try to heal the nation's wounds, we might say. Civil rights leader is your next heading. King first gained prominence as a leader of the Montgomery bus boycott of 55 and 1956. Convinced that political and social freedoms were attainable through nonviolence, following, of course, Gandhi's ideas. He led boycotts, marches, and sit-ins to protest segregation, injustice, and the economic oppression of African Americans. A charismatic orator, King soon became known as the most eloquent and influential leader of the civil rights movement. In April of 1963, he crystallized the movement's aims and methods in his letter from Birmingham City Jail. So let's write it down. 1963. This is the foundational document that in many ways crystallizes his movement's aims and methods for civil rights. 4 months later, he helped organize the March on Washington, where he delivered his memorable speech, I Have a Dream. So let's get this in our notes. I know that you've studied several times in your academic career the I Have a Dream speech. Let's make sure we understand. 4 months before, Martin Luther King Jr. is thrown into jail in the town of Birmingham, Alabama. And there he writes this famous letter while he's in jail. Although, back to the reading now on page 1108, although King stressed nonviolence, He became a martyr for freedom when he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4th, 1968. Before her death in 2006, his widow, Coretta Scott King, worked to keep King's message and achievements alive. The King children continue to carry on their parents' work. Of course, you have a great quote there at the bottom of 1108, all labor that uplifts humanity has dignity and importance and should be undertaken with painstaking excellence, end quote. Let's look at the background information on 1109. Of course, you got this famous picture of Martin Luther King Jr. sitting in a jail cell in the Jefferson County Courthouse in Birmingham, Alabama, right? Here's the background information. Read it with me at the top of 1109. By the late 1950s, Martin Luther King Jr. had emerged as a key figure of the civil rights movement. During the Kennedy administration, King was arrested in April 1963 for protesting racial segregation in Birmingham, Alabama. As he sat in jail, he read a newspaper article in which 8 white clergymen, that's to say preachers, criticized him for, quote, unwise and untimely demonstrations. Without proper writing paper, King drafted a response, this letter, in the cramped margins of that newspaper. So we'll now turn, now again, this is just part of the letter. It's not the entire letter. I obviously recommend that you Google the entire letter, and you can certainly read it online. Let's turn now to a reading of this text, and we want to pay attention to the argument that he makes, okay, as he is responding to these 8 white clergymen who are saying that King and the civil rights protesters should not be doing what they're doing. It's bad timing, it's not appropriate, it's unwise. Okay, it's not a good idea. Let's listen to how King will respond in this famous letter, and then we'll come back to work at level 1 and of course 2. Let's go to work.
From Letter from Birmingham City Jail by Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. I hope the church as a whole will meet the challenge of this decisive hour. But even if the church does not come to the aid of justice, I have no despair about the future. I have no fear about the outcome of our struggle in Birmingham, even if our motives are presently misunderstood. We will reach the goal of freedom in Birmingham and all over the nation, because the goal of America is freedom. Abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up with the destiny of America. Before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, we were here. Before the pen of Jefferson etched across the pages of history the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence, we were here. For more than 2 centuries, our foreparents labored in this country without wages. They made cotton king, and they built the homes of their masters in the midst of brutal injustice and shameful humiliation. And yet out of a bottomless vitality, they continued to thrive and develop. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery could not stop us, the opposition we now face will surely fail. We will win our freedom because the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of God are embodied in our echoing demands. I must close now, but before closing I am impelled to mention one other point in your statement that troubled me profoundly. You warmly commended the Birmingham police force for keeping order and preventing violence. I don't believe you would have so warmly commended the police force if you had seen its angry, violent dogs literally biting 6 unarmed, non-violent Negroes. I don't believe you would so quickly commend the policemen if you would observe their ugly and inhuman treatment of Negroes here in the city jail. If you would watch them push and curse old Negro women and young Negro girls, if you would see them slap and kick old Negro men and young Negro boys, if you will observe them, as they did on 2 occasions, refuse to give us food because we wanted to sing our grace together. I'm sorry that I can't join you in your praise for the police department. It is true that they have been rather disciplined in their public handling of the demonstrators. In this sense, they have been rather publicly nonviolent. But for what purpose? To preserve the evil system of segregation? Over the last few years, I have consistently preached that nonviolence demands that the means we use must be as pure as the ends we seek. So I have tried to make it clear that it is wrong to use immoral means to attain moral ends. But now I must affirm that it is just as wrong, or even more so, to use moral means to preserve immoral ends. Maybe Mr. Connor and his policemen have been rather publicly nonviolent, as Chief Pritchett was in Albany, Georgia, but they have used the moral means of nonviolence to maintain the immoral end of flagrant racial injustice. T.S. Eliot has said that there is no greater treason than to do the right deed for the wrong reason. I wish you had commended the Negro sit-inners and demonstrators of Birmingham for their sublime courage, their willingness to suffer, and their amazing discipline in the midst of the most inhuman provocation. One day the South will recognize its real heroes. They will be the James Merediths, courageously and with a majestic sense of purpose, facing jeering and hostile mobs and the agonizing loneliness that characterizes the life of the pioneer. They will be old, oppressed, battered Negro women, symbolized in a 72-year-old woman of Montgomery, Alabama, who rose up with a sense of dignity and with her people decided not to ride the segregated buses, and responded to one who inquired about her tiredness with ungrammatical profundity. My feet is tired, but my soul is rested. They will be the young high school and college students, young ministers of the gospel, and a host of their elders courageously and nonviolently sitting in at lunch counters and willingly going to jail for conscience sake. One day, the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sat down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for the best in the American dream and the most sacred values in our Judeo-Christian heritage, and thusly carrying our whole nation back to those great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Never before have I written a letter this long, or should I say a book. I'm afraid that it is much too long to take your precious time. I can assure you that it would have been much shorter if I had been writing from a comfortable desk. But what else is there to do when you are alone for days in the dull monotony of a narrow jail cell other than write long letters, think strange thoughts, and pray long prayers? If I have said anything in this letter that is an overstatement of the truth and is indicative of an unreasonable impatience, I beg you to forgive me. If I have said anything in this letter that is an understatement of the truth and is indicative of my having a patience that makes me patient with anything less than brotherhood, I beg God to forgive me. I hope this letter finds you strong in the faith. I also hope that circumstances will soon make it possible for me to meet each of you, not as an integrationist or a civil rights leader, but as a fellow clergyman and a Christian brother. Let us all hope that the dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away, and the deep fog of misunderstanding will be lifted from our fear-drenched communities. In some not too distant tomorrow, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine over our great nation with all of their scintillating beauty. Yours for the cause of peace and brotherhood, Martin Luther King, Jr.
Now, one of the tragedies about our study here is that we're only looking at the last and final words of this amazing letter. It is a long letter. He even, notice, ironically says, I may have written a book here, please forgive me, but what else do you have to do when you're sitting in a narrow jail cell other than maybe write, or, as he said, think strange thoughts and pray long prayers? The irony, of course, is dripping at that point at the end. And what you don't have the opportunity to do in this cutting is to have a real sense of the way that the end of the letter is set up by the beginning of the letter, rhetorically speaking. But be that as it may, this is the cutting that we've been provided in our textbook. And so let's go ahead and study it now together, working quickly now through level 1. Let's point out something right away at level 1. I'm with you now on page 1109. Notice right away, he begins by saying on page 1109, we're picking up again with the final lines of the actual letter itself, even though it's the beginning of our reading, that I have no despair about the future, I have no fear about the outcome. He begins with hope because he talks about the future. But notice he immediately goes in the next few lines to the past. So notice he will do something, I'm making a 3A observation here, something very similar to what John F. Kennedy will have done in his inaugural address, where there's two directions this letter is always going to go. One, backwards looking. Where does he look? Back to the founding thinkers. He calls them the founding fathers. Back to Jefferson, back to the Declaration of Independence. 4 months later, when he's standing at the Lincoln Memorial, he actually will reference Jefferson very early in his I Have a Dream speech for the same reason. He wants to take Americans and American readers here, for example, the specifically 8 white clergy members who have been really critical of him, wants to take them back to a time in the past. That is to say, the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Let's keep going. On to page 110. Notice he continues with this pages of history. And then he makes a compelling observation, which is going to remind us a lot of our study of Langston Hughes. Notice what he says. We will win because, he says, we were here. Watch what he says. The final lines at the bottom of 1109. Before the pen of Jefferson etched across the pages of history the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence, lines I just quoted, we were here. We who were here? Who's the we he's talking about? Well, of course, notice the game that's being played here. Jefferson will write it as, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And as I say in my lecture on the Declaration of Independence, there's a lot of debate about what the antecedent of the pronoun we is in that Declaration of Independence. Here, notice, we were here. Obviously, you can make the argument that what he's saying is black people were here long before. Why? Well, he says it. For more than 2 centuries, our foreparents labored in this country without wages. Notice he stays away from calling them slaves. He rather calls them foreparents laboring in the country without wages. That's a graceful way to say they were forced to do work they didn't get to choose to do. They made cotton king, and they built the homes of their masters in the midst of brutal injustice and shameful humiliation. And yet, out of a bottomless vitality, they continued to thrive and develop. Again, it reminds us of Langston Hughes's I Too. We'll just make that observation at 3A. Go back and look again at that poem by Langston Hughes, I Too. He says it, I Too. He says it, doesn't he, in that poem? I will eat and grow strong. Notice this is the same exact argument that King is making. In other words, he says it this way. If black people of the South who were slaves were strong enough to make it through that generational, terrible situation, we're going to make it through this just fine. We will get there. We will get there. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery could not stop us, the oppression we now face will surely fail. We will win our freedom. because the sacred heritage of our nation, eternal will of God are embodied in our echoing demands. By the way, let's just point out at 3A, since we're making these comparisons, do you notice how in both texts, Kennedy's inauguration speech and this letter from a Birmingham jail, that both authors are constantly referencing God and are constantly referencing religion? Now, of course, that makes sense if you're a clergyman, as Martin Luther King Jr. was. But of course, it begs the question, why would President Kennedy so quickly feel comfortable doing that as well in his speech? Now, let's point out a genius, very subtle thing that MLK does in the next paragraph. I'm with you on page 1110, first major paragraph. Look what he says. I must close now. This is the end of the letter. And again, unfortunately, you don't get a sense of how long this letter is. If you Google it, you'll see it's a long letter. He's been writing words for quite some time when he gets to this. I must close now. But before closing, I am, look at the word he uses. Look at the word he uses. I am impelled to mention one other point. Impelled. Do you have any memory at all of how that word gets used in an earlier conversation? When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have blah, 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 blah. Remember this? The Declaration of Independence, right? A decent respect to the opinions of mankind impels that they should declare the causes. Very interesting. So in other words, King is going back to the very founding document of America, the Declaration of Independence, and saying, I do not have a choice. Just like Jefferson says in Declaration of Independence, we do not have a choice. We must declare our independence. Here, notice, King is playing the